off again. Welcome to the Travel Massive Live podcasting panel. Want to thank everybody for joining us today. And as you can see on the next slide, I am your host and moderator, Ric Gazarian. I'm a chapter leader here in Bangkok, as well as the Asia coordinator. I'm also a podcaster myself. You can check out my podcast on Counting Countries. And on the next slide, you can see our incredible panel. I am very excited. We have 3 podcasting veterans. They're going to be sharing with us a lot of incredible and excellent insights of podcasting. And before we jump into the panel discussion, there's several things that I want to touch upon today. Why you should be updating your Travel Massive profile list, the Travel Massive podcast, and housekeeping. So on the next slide, I'm going to tell you why you should be updating your profile on Travel Massive. You might be surprised how well Travel Massive ranks on Google, meaning your Travel Massive profile might be the highest ranking link when you search for your own name. And many times it's going to rank higher than LinkedIn. So you can see one of our panelists here, Palle. Travel Massive is the 3rd URL listed, and LinkedIn is coming below that. So I'm encouraging everybody to take their time, keep their profiles update, because that might be the first thing that many people see. On the next slide, we have over 60,000 members in the Travel Massive community, and we found a new way to highlight some of those members with powerful lists. And I'm going to show you a couple of them. Right here, you can see 100 women inspiring travel finders. On the next one, we have 50 travel startups to watch in 2020. And on the next one, 33 travel podcasters you should be listening to now, including all 3 of our panelists. You can find a link to all of our list at Travel Massive on the bottom of travelmassive.com under community. And the next slide, just to let you know, Travel Massive has their own podcast hosted by Kevin O'Shaughnessy in Dublin. So check that out and make sure you're subscribing on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Now, the next slide, we're going to look at housekeeping for a minute. Please remember you have the chat box. We'd love to get some questions from you. We'll be recording this presentation, and it will be able to stream it practically right after this presentation on YouTube, Facebook, and Travel Massive. So that replay will be there. Feel free to leave us any feedback, and make sure you've signed up for Travel Massive Live so you can keep in touch with all of our great live webinars that we're doing. And there's some very fresh news today you can see on the next slide. We are already announcing our next presentation in regards to podcasting. This will be on June 2nd, and this, in essence, is the second part of our podcasting webinar. This will be more of an advanced class. So at this point, I want to start bringing in our panelists. Excellent, Evo. It's great to see you. So I'm excited to bring in our 3 panelists. We're going to start off with Evo Terra. And for those trivia buffs, Evo is the author of Podcasting for Dummies. So Evo, I'm hoping you can take a moment through your N95 mask and introduce yourself.
Not an N95 mask, just a cloth mask, because we should all be wearing cloth masks every time we go outside, except I'm not outside. I'm in the studio. So I'll pull that down for a minute and say, hey, everybody, I am Evo Terra. Thanks, Ric, for inviting me to the program. As Ric said, I'm a long-time podcaster. Been at this since 2004, believe it or not. I run a podcast consultancy where I work with businesses and do all the podcasting things necessary for them. And I have a daily show that I put out 4 days a week at least called Podcast Pontifications, which tells you about the future of podcasting and things working podcasters should be thinking of. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Evo, thank you. Next up, we're going to bring in Susan Schwartz. And Susan's first words as a baby, I don't know if people know this, were shaken, not stirred. And that has something to do with her passion in her podcast. So Susan, welcome please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Rick, so much for having me here. I started travel writing about almost 10 years ago. I started my first blog in 2011 called Best Bits Worldwide. And after eating one huge meal too many on a press trip, I realized that I liked drinking more than I liked eating. And actually, I started to talk to the bartender. He had a great story. I went to see if there were any podcasts that had those stories. I couldn't find one, so I started mine. And it's called Lush Life Podcast. And I also write about drinks and travel at alushlifemanual.com. So that's me in a nutshell.
Excellent, Susan. Thank you. And we'll be hearing from you later. And next up, I want to bring our third panelist, Palle Bo. Palle, you've been in the radio industry in Denmark since 1985. And I also believe maybe back then you were doing prank phone calls for the radio, but we can talk about that later. But I'm hoping you can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, that's right, Rick. I've been doing radio forever since I was 2 years old, back in '85 or something like that. No, and when it comes to podcasting, I was a late mover. I started in 2006, so I thought actually I left the boat on that one. So I'm a bit jealous that Rick he beat me. No, Evo he beat me on that one. I am originally from Denmark. I'm a full-time traveler. Right now I'm in Cape Town, so I could use a cocktail because there's a total alcohol ban down here. I saw someone else from South Africa in the chat, but I'm a full-time traveler, and now I'm in Cape Town. I've been here for a couple of months, and I do the Radio Vagabond podcast. Also, I run a production company called Radio Guru, where I help clients podcast and do other kinds of radio or sound production for them. So that's a bit about me.
Excellent. Thank you, Palle. And I'm going to bring back Evo. I'm hoping to get some really brief updates from our three panelists, where they are and how the COVID situation is. Evo, I believe you're in Phoenix. What's it like in Arizona?
Like most places in the States, weird combination of people who are respecting the realities that we now face in a going on pandemic world, and those that don't, which is a little bit of a change, a little bit of a challenge, I should say. But by and large, we're doing fine. I'm very fortunate that my family has been not directly impacted by anything. Some indirect impacts, obviously, but so far we're all fine, healthy, and hale, and just continuing to do the right sorts of things so that we can not prolong this for any longer than absolutely necessary.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you guys are safe. Palle, you mentioned no alcohol in South Africa, but how is South Africa faring under COVID?
Well, we have a very strict lockdown down here. We just went from level 5 to level 4, and now they're talking about a lot of the countries going to level 3. But here in the Western Cape, they're even talking about that we stay at level 4 or maybe go to level 5. And that's where it's so strict that we can only go out if we need to go to the pharmacy or the supermarket. We can't even go for a run or walk the dog if we had a dog. So it's pretty strict here, even though the country is not that severely hit by the COVID-19. There are not that many cases if you look at the size of the country, but that might be because they're taking it serious. But yeah, and there's no indication on when there's going to be international flights again. I love South Africa and I love Cape Town especially, so it's not the worst place to be stuck. And I live in a nice area in my own apartment, so I feel safe and I'm fine by being here right now. Just gotta ride out the storm here. Okay,
great. Thank you, Palle. And Susan, can you give us a brief update? What's happening in England? You're on mute, I believe.
Sorry about that. So I'm in London, yes, as you said, and we're now in this kind of weird situation of stay alert, which means we can go out as many times as we want to exercise. We can see someone who's not within our family, but we have to stay 2 meters apart. It's kind of this nebulous, not sure really what we're doing. But it's a good thing is that the numbers are going down of who's dying every day. But we haven't had such a good show. We're one of the countries that had the most deaths so far. So yes, like Evo, it hasn't impacted me and my family, thank goodness. But I know a lot of people who it has. So we're just trying to stay safe.
Thanks,
and thank
Susan.
goodness alcohol is not all the alcohol shops are open and definitely ready for business.
Well, Palle might have to sneak out of South Africa and get to England. Thank you, Susan. And I want to bring Evo back. Evo, I've heard from so many travel bloggers of traffic going down 70, 80, 90% since COVID rolled in and just dramatically changed the entire environment. How's COVID affected the industry of podcasting? Is it a positive? Is it a negative? Give us a broad overview of how that's been affected.
I think it really depends on how you measure, but the measurement that I like to look at is what's happening from the creator perspective. Are people continuing to create new podcasts and new podcast episodes? And that is a resounding absolutely. We're seeing massive numbers. It's huge, record-breaking numbers in brand new podcasts coming to market right now. Just looking back at last month, April, we saw almost 100,000 new shows added. The exact number is 90,977. That's brand new shows that were added to Apple Podcasts, which is our de facto directory out there. 90,000, which beat the prior month of March by almost 30,000. And that's huge. I mean, the other way to think about that is there are just over 1 million podcasts listed in Apple Podcasts. 10% of those, almost 10% of those were added last month. So podcasting is continuing to grow more so than it ever has been. Podcast has always been kind of a slow growth medium. Adoption rates high. We're now like at 35% of the people listen to podcasts on a regular basis, which beats Twitter, which is great. But we are seeing a lot more new shows added. Consumption has changed, definitely. People's commutes have been impacted, so they're not listening as much when they're on the go. They're shifting the types of content they're listening to. Lots of news and information is happening. So we are seeing some shifts in behavior from the people who listen, but we are seeing a huge number of people who want to still make great content, which excites me.
Okay, great, Evo. And I'm going to bring Susan back. Susan.
Yes.
Question for you. Why podcasting? Why not photography? Why not a blog? Why not producing video documentaries? Why is podcasting an effective medium for storytelling?
That's an interesting question because it was the one that I was drawn to originally, maybe because of my love of podcasts before I started podcasting. When I was listening to this story that this bartender was telling me, I felt it was so intimate. And I feel that there's something intimate about a podcast more so than a video, especially in the podcasting that I do, where I interview people and ask them about their life story. So maybe because I feel like we're talking to one person, that one listener, or, obviously I have many more than one listener, but that one who's tuning in maybe for the first time, all my listeners, I feel like we're speaking to them specifically to them. And when people talk about their life, it is quite an intimate thing. And I don't know, I just felt that it was my first go-to. I never thought about doing anything else.
Okay, great. And Palle, I want to ask you the same question. You are on a quest right now. You are traveling to all 193 countries in the world, and you've decided to share your journey via podcasting. So in essence, same question for you. Why didn't you say pen and paper? Why didn't you say a photo journal? Why audio?
Well, it's I got into radio because of my passion for it. It was a hobby to begin with, and even though I've been doing radio for that many years and audio production, it's still a passion for me. So for me, it was obvious that I wanted to do that. I I never started it as a big goal to make money, or of course I wanted people to listen, but I mostly did it because I wanted to have it as a scrapbook for myself. I feel it's a good way that I can sort of capture my memories with audio and with the sound effects of the place I'm at. And what Susan said is so true. It's been really something I've been preaching for a long time when it comes to radio, when I was a program director as well, that as radio podcasting is a one-to-one medium, you're speaking to a lot of people, but one person at a time, and that's where it's different than any other medium. I feel when we're talking audio in general, even though if there's 6 people in a car listening to the same podcast or radio program, they're listening one-on-one, so you get really close with the listeners, and for me that's just I get a personal relationship, and I feel that's just one of the many reasons I enjoy doing a podcast.
So a follow-up question for you, Palle. You've been documenting your journey to all 193 countries. What type of
not yet.
Well, on the way. What type of feedback are you getting from your listeners? I mean, are people saying like, "Oh, I want to follow in your footsteps," or are they saying, I'm an armchair traveler and I just love watching the journey through your voice? What are you hearing from them?
I'm so happy to say that I get a lot of emails from my listeners and a lot of messages, and the most general thing is that they're saying that they're going on a journey with me. They feel like they're with me on the journey without leaving the comfort of their own home, and that's one of the things I feel is great for a travel podcast. And that's also kind of an opportunity right now where people can't go anywhere, that they can listen to a travel podcast. So I'm not seeing declining numbers at all. My numbers were going up in the last couple of months. So maybe that's different. I don't know.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Evo, let's get down to brass tacks. I know you have a consulting business where you advise people on how to start podcasts. So let's say I am a novice. Let's say I'm a person who wants to start podcasting. What type of hardware, at the minimum, do I need to get the ball rolling? So I don't want to invest a ton of money because I'm not sure if this is going to be a viable proposition for me, but just to get the ball rolling.
Well, technically, you don't need anything. I mean, if you have a smartphone, you can record and publish and have a podcast. It's really a question of how good do you want it to sound. It's like anything in life. What do you need to start a blog? You can just fire up Blogger if you want to and start typing, right? That's simple enough to do. What do you want to do if you want to start taking videos of your travels? Well, you can just pull out your cell phone and capture some videos that way. It's what you want to do on top of that. That gets interesting. But I always, when I'm talking with clients, I say, look, don't let the infrastructure build out stop you. If it's a passion project, if you have something to say and you want to say it, then just say it. It's relatively straightforward to begin. Now, if you want to layer in higher production values, like, big fat Shure SM7B microphones like I'm sitting here in front, or other sorts of elements, of course, like anything in life, you can spend as much as you want to. But there's not for most people, I understand I am speaking from a point of privilege here, but for most people, the cost and tech outlay to have a podcast up and live is a secondary thought. It's easy.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. You said it's as simple as having a smartphone. Mm-hmm. So is there an app that you recommend that I utilize to have a recording?
No, I said it is as simple as using a smartphone. I do not recommend anyone use their smartphone to do that. There are apps out there. If that's what you want to do, great, and find them. Just like I wouldn't recommend using, what free blogging platform. I'm not going to recommend what cheapo tools are out there. They exist. Which one do I recommend? None of them. That's why my business, I typically only work with clients who are businesses who have a budget, who are willing to spend the money on getting good quality gear, getting some great insulating materials in their office and studio so that they cut down all the reverb and make it sound as professional as is possible. That still doesn't have to be expensive. It's an outlay of hundreds or maybe thousands of dollars. Sure, I get that. But that's how, if you want to step it up to the next level and do things, go there.
Yeah. So let's work our way up there. So again, I'm a novice.
Mhm.
I have a couple of $100s to spend. What do I need to do to get the ball rolling to get my first recording?
So all you need to do is a microphone to record it. That's it. I mean, you need something to record your content. So whether that's your smartphone, whether that's a Samson Q2U microphone, or one of the other hundreds of microphones that are out there, many of which you may have in your already on you, great. Use that microphone to start recording some content. You then need to be able to somehow edit that audio into something that sounds good. And so there are.
Well, we're going to get to that a little bit later. So
right.
What you're saying is, for less than $100, I can purchase a microphone in addition to the laptop, and now I have all the hardware that I need.
That's the basic information. I mean, you need to be able to capture sound. I mean, a podcast is a recording of something. Your voice, the nature sounds that are out there, interviews with guests. It can be whatever you want it to be. So you need something to capture the audio with. That's step one.
Okay, great. And I'm going to bring in Palle next. Thank you, Evo. And Palle, let's talk about, we touched on the hardware that you need to get the ball rolling. And I mean, there's typically two ways to record. One is in person. The second is over the internet. So I know you do a lot of recordings in person. So what type of software do you need to start doing a recording in person?
Well, basically, you need to be able to record people, and just this one, the Zoom H1N, it's around. I saw it at $120 US dollars. It's good, and you can use it for interviews. I have the big brother here, the Zoom H6. They have a couple of different versions. That's a little bit more expensive, like $300 or something like that. And that's my go-to thing when I'm out in the field. I literally sit with the dead cat on here, and I do the interview directly with people sitting across the table from them. And the reason I do this and not have like a microphone like this plugged into it, I could do that, is that I like having the stereo sound, because I like to I rarely sit in a quiet room with my guest. I try to get out there where you maybe can hear the scooters of Hanoi or Bangkok in the background, or a mosque, or the languages, because it is a travel podcast I do. That's one of the reasons I really enjoy doing in-person interviews. So when I'm recording, I'm not using any software. That comes in the editing part. It's just, for me, a matter of getting it recorded as good as I possibly can. And another thing is, because I do it where there might be some sound in the background, I don't mind sound. Of course, it can't be too loud so you can't hear what we're talking about, but it's no music in the background. So if I get into a cafe and there's music in the background, that doesn't work, because there's licensing problems, and then I won't be able to edit as well. But sitting in a cafe with the cars and a bit of surround sound, that's perfectly fine. And then once I've done the interview, I make sure that I have 30 or 60 seconds of just the clean sound of the environment recorded as well. And that's just a little bit of the way I work with the podcast when I'm doing in-person interviews. Another reason I prefer to do that is just, it makes it more interesting in when you're sitting across the table from someone. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Palle. Susan, are you doing any recordings over the web, or are all your recordings in person?
Well, now I'm doing them over the web, but before COVID, I was only doing them in person. As I said, I interview people about their upbringing, what got them into bartending, their history, sometimes quite intimate details. And I always felt, and I still do, that you get to know people better and more out of people. I think they feel more comfortable when you're doing it face to face. And these are also people that I see. A lot of bar people I've interviewed in London, I see them a lot as well. They become friends. I don't know. There's something about meeting people face to face where you get to know them a little more. So I've had to change that, or I wouldn't have a podcast. And so now I've started to interview people using, now everyone should know Evo is my producer, and he suggested I use something called Squadcast. And it's been great. It is a platform that you can see people like this, but you can also, it just records sound. So it records my sound here and their sound there. So even if the internet kind of screws up, they're still capturing the sound where they are. So it's been great, and I've been able to, do my Lush Life episodes the way I feel that I like them to be.
Okay, so as an example, if you're looking for software to record over the internet, Evo and yourself are recommending Squadcast.
Oh, I don't know what Evo is recommending. I've been using this; it's the only one I've used so far, and it's been working well for me. You'd have to ask Evo what he recommends.
Great. And I believe Squadcast is a paid service. So just for people to know, there's an alternative called Zencastr. Zencastr is the same concept of Squadcast, probably not as efficient or good, but that's a free service that you can check out as well. So thank you, Susan. And Palle, we're talking about interviewing.
Can I add a little bit to that? What you said about because I'm using Zencastr at the moment. I'm producing a podcast series for a global company as well, and we're using Zencastr for that. The whole thing is that we want people to have a microphone, either have a headset or even better, a USB microphone plugged in, because then we get the better sound. I did a lot of research and I chose Zencastr over, and there is a free version as well, but if you want WAV files, you have to pay a little bit for it. And that's also what I'm doing. I'm using when I'm producing Travel Matters, the T-Bex podcast with Ric Gazarian sitting in close to San Diego, and me wherever I am, and then we have guests. So we're using Zencastr for that, and I'm happy with that program.
Okay, so it sounds like we have votes for both Squadcast and Zencastr. So those are two great platforms for recording your interviews when you're online. So Palle, you are doing a lot of interviews. You've been doing them for a couple of decades plus. What are some tips for a good interview?
Well, when I'm having a guest, I really want to make them feel safe. I tell them that I won't be asking any gotcha questions. I will make them sound good, and I also say if they say something wrong, just let me know and take it over, and I will edit and make you sound amazing. And that makes them relax a lot in the beginning. Also, I've been experimenting with using lavalier microphones to get people not to have the feeling that they're being recorded, because some people, they are getting anxious when they're being recorded and sound different. It's like when you're taking a photo and you're being having your photo taken, you're sort of you're not your natural self, and I want them to be their natural self and relax and have a conversation with them more than an interview. So I'm trying to make the conversation sound as if it was two friends talking about travel together. And then I ask I get them to tell the story by asking them open-ended questions like the what, where, when, and who and why, of course. And I try not to stick to a fixed list of questions. I try to go in and out and just go look for the story and really try to listen what it is that they're saying, so I can ask follow-up questions, and asking something like, how did that make you feel? And can you take me back to that moment? Tell me that again with as many details as you possibly can, so I can have them paint a picture of what it is that we're supposed to seeing, what they're experiencing. And then I really just try to be curious and ask the questions that I want to hear, because my podcast is about travel. I'm interested and curious about travel and the people that I speak to. So I really just try to use my curiosity. That really counts. And then one final thing is, when it's over, I try not to push stop on the recording, because something good might happen right after that, and then I'm still recording, and I can quickly pick it up and continue So that's a small trick at the end, because sometimes when they think, okay, now we're done, then they tell me the really good story, and I want that on tape as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Kind of let them get their guard down and even a bit more comfortable, and you can hear the real juicy stuff. Thank you, Palle. Mm-hmm. Evo, you've interviewed hundreds, or I'm guessing thousands of people over your career. So same question to you. Any advice for interviews?
Only do interviews if you enjoy doing interviews and are good at doing interviews. As you mentioned, Rick, I have conducted many an interview back when I pre-podcasting, like Palle. I am an old radio guy, and it was all interview-based radio programming we were doing, and then radio interview-based podcasting is where I went to for the first couple of years. But then I stopped doing that because I'm not very good at it. And I think I know why I'm not very good at the interviewing process, but it is not my forte. So what I would suggest to you is, and this may sound crazy, but you do not have to do an interview-based podcast. That is not a requirement. Not all podcasts are interview-based. My show is an interview-based. My show is a monologue where I get on and talk for less than 10 minutes, 4 days a week. When my wife and I were doing our travel podcast back in 2015, when we were traveling the world, it was not based on interviews. It was based on the two of us walking around various countries we found ourselves in with our earbuds from our smartphones, recording the conversation my wife and I were having. We would then go back into the studio, and by we, I mean I would go back into the studio, and by studio, I mean random farmhouse we were living in, and take that audio, which we had recorded during the week we had been there, and find the choice bits, assemble it all together, and release the sounds and conversations that we were having in coherent stories for people to enjoy and listen to. So don't be caught up on the idea that you have to do an interview show. Some of the more interesting programs out there have no interviews on them whatsoever. Can you interview? Absolutely, you can, but that's not all you can do. It's audio, and whatever you can do to make something that is interesting sounding, let's make something that sounds interesting.
Okay, so I think there's a really great takeaway there, Evo, that you shared, and it's basically stick to your knitting. So in other words, if you like conversing with one person or even a couple, stick to an interview format. If you like talking in general, you can do a monologue, or you can just do something with your partner and bring up different topics or interesting things for every different episode. And let's kind of extend that a little bit further, because you just touched on it a minute. So we've all spoken during this panel about recording an episode, recording a podcast. But once you get that file, that audio file, what do you do with it? So in other words, do you have to sound engineer it? Do you have to edit it? What's the process once you've got that file, Evo?
So once you have collected the file, or files, most cases it's lots of different files, they have to be assembled together. Just like you have to use a text editor to assemble your text when you're writing your blog posts, you need to have an audio editor that allows you to assemble all the different clips that you're using. If it's just the interview, great. There's the two sides of the conversation, plus your intro and your outro, plus the bed music and all these things. And it sounds terrifying and crazy. It's really not. There are lots of tools out there. You just need some audio editing tools. Chances are, if you're a Mac user, you have one by default installed on your computer. It's called GarageBand. And if you don't have one installed, then there's another tool called Audacity. And both of these tools are free, relatively simple to use, which will allow you to do what you need to do. Plus, there are a whole plethora of online tools. A company called Alitu, A-L-I-T-U, I believe, exists, to where you can do it all on the cloud. You just upload all of your different segments and assemble it the way that you want to. It's getting a lot easier to do that these days with specialized software that lives on your computer or it lives in the cloud. I don't use those tools. I use a professional tool called Hindenburg Journalist Pro, which is designed to assemble journalistic style conversations much more efficiently and easily. But that's the next step, is you need something to allow you to assemble all those bits and pieces, trim them, clean them, adjust the levels, EQs, effects, all those various things, and then push export so you have the final file, which will be uploaded to your podcast hosting company.
Okay, so the takeaway, I guess, if you're more of a novice, not a professional like yourself, is option one. If you're using Windows, you can look to Audacity, which is a free software which you can download, which you can utilize to make your file. And then you said if you're on the Mac, it's GarageBand. Those are two options of many which are out there. And does it matter what type of file you create, Evo? In other words, does it have to be a WAV file, an MP3 or MP4?
Yes is the short answer to that, but it depends on what you mean by create. You want to record all of your audio in the highest quality possible. So that's typically something like a WAV, W-A-V, or an uncompressed audio file. That's what you want to work with during the editing process. But when you're done, whatever tool you're using should have an easy export that allows it to be put in the proper podcasting format. MP3 is the easy answer. The more complicated answer gets to do with bit rates and sample rates and channel settings, which is probably too much information here. But most podcasts, not all, but most podcasts are distributed as an MP3, which is a slightly smaller file than the uncompressed WAV files.
Excellent. And as you noted, there's a lot more advanced stuff to overview, and we'll be having a follow-up on June 2nd with Kevin, who will go a little deeper down the rabbit hole to talk about some of these technical aspects. Thank you, Evo. Let's hear back from Palle. So, Palle, once you've created this file, once you've edited it and added in the music and the bumpers and you engineered the sound, where's the file go?
Well, it has to go out there to the world, and you need to have it uploaded to a hosting company. I use Libsyn. I know that Ric does as well. It just works, and you pay a little bit. I think the cheapest is $5 per month, 7 if you want some stats, and then if you're uploading a bit more, you have to go a little bit up in the different packages they are. I know that Anchor are also doing it, and they're a part of Spotify now, and free as far as I know. The thing is that don't get a plugin to your WordPress site and then upload it there, and just upload the WAV files in your WordPress site. I am so embarrassed to say that I did that myself, and once I started having it worked fine in the beginning, but then I started having downloads and the whole thing crashed and it cut off half of the episodes or something like that. No, you want a decent hosting company to have the file, and I am pretty sure that Evo, who's much more technical minded than me, can add something to this. So you might just want to ask Evo if he's got something here to add.
And Palle, I will take you up on that, and I'm going to bring in Evo. So, we're talking about podcast hosting. Palle mentioned Libsyn, which I think is sort of the de facto choice in the industry in many ways to host podcasts. But give us some more insights. What companies should I be utilizing, or thoughts of where am I going to host my podcast, Evo?
Well, I think the important thing to get out of this is what Palle said. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt to self-host your media files on your dream host website or your HostGator or whatever. I know they say they give you unlimited bandwidth. They lie. They lie terribly. So do not try and just host the media files on your own. What you need to do is get a relationship with a dedicated podcast hosting company. That is all that they do. Not a company that also posts a lot of stuff for bands and lets them put their tracks out there. No. Dedicated podcast media hosting company. Libsyn has been around for the longer than anybody else. They're the big dogs and the guns out there. Blueberry is another company that works well. I'm on the board of a relatively new podcast hosting company called Captivate.fm. Some new modernized tools, but there are, oh my gosh, dozens, if not close to 100 different options for you. And here's the thing. They all do basically the same thing. They allow you to host your media files in a highly available manner so that if it does get popular, you're not going to be, your website's not going to come crashing down, which happens all the time when people try to self-host their media files. They provide for you an RSS feed, which all you need to know about is that's what connects your show to all the various podcast directories. They keep it all maintained and updated. All podcast hosting companies do those two things. It's going down the details of which one you should get to. Well, then there are lots of other conversations for us to have. But just make sure you use a dedicated podcast media hosting company.
Okay, so you heard it from Evo, everybody. Make sure you're utilizing a company that specializes in hosting podcasts. Don't fool around. Go to one of the professionals. And Evo, you mentioned earlier in our conversation that podcasting has exploded. I mean, there's over 1 million, great growth this year alone. Just like there's been a great growth in podcasts, from what I can tell, there's also been incredible growth in the different ways you can listen to a podcast. So if you can, give us a broad overview as a consumer of content. How am I going to listen to all these great podcasts?
You're exactly right, Rick. There are lots of ways we can listen. For those of us that have been podcasting for a long time, we think podcasting is connected to, well, now a smartphone, and people use a podcast listening app like Apple Podcasts is default installed on every iPhone, every iOS device that's out there, and that is still the most popular platform people use to find as well as listen to shows. But now we have our friends at Google Podcasts. Google has finally made a decent podcasting player, which is native, believe it or not, built into all the Android devices. It's just whether you can find it or not is a different thing. Spotify came out last year, I think it was. Yeah. Last year, Spotify, or the year before, came out and said, we also have podcasts now. And so now there are 250 million active users of a tool called Spotify around the world that suddenly found themselves with lots of podcasts to listen to. So app listening, in-app listening is very popular. We now live in the COVID-19 world where people aren't commuting, I mentioned previously. And so we're seeing desktop and laptop-based listening increase significantly, where people actually do go to your website, go to the episodes page itself, and just click play right there on the embedded audio player that exists. We also live in a world that is full of smart speakers. I know I have like 7 different smart speakers in my 2-bedroom condo, because it's what I do. And smart speakers is a growing consumption pattern. It's not huge yet, but we are definitely seeing an increase, especially as more people are staying at home. It's very convenient to say, hey, activating word, play this particular podcast, and it tends to work now. So, and there's in-car. We didn't talk about in-car audio. That's another way that's listening. There are interfaces that are built into cars, which actually have the built-in app players right there. So that's an easy method. Really, it's listening anywhere somebody is. There's chances are they have a device on them which will play a podcast.
Okay, and I can chime in. I have an Alexa in my house, so It's kind of fun to direct Alexa to play my own podcast every now and then. Evo, give us
everybody's Alexa just went off because you said that. I was being nice, not saying the words. Go ahead.
Evo, give us an idea if you can. It's always interesting to see what's the market share. So I think number one is Apple Podcasts, but give us the top 3 or 4 or 5 players with their percentage of the industry.
Well, Apple definitely is the lion's share. Of course, this is going to change country to country, depending on how penetration models look out. But if we look at the U.S. as people typically do, it's over 50% of podcast consumption happens in Apple's ecosystem. So that means, by and large, the Apple Podcast player. That's where most consumption happens. Second to that is Spotify, but the percentage-wise, depending on who you talk to, is anywhere from 10 to 20%. Of the rest is on Spotify. Google is next, but Google is very difficult to track for technical reasons that are based on how Google Podcasts interfaces across all of Google's ecosystem. Short version is it's hard for a podcast hosting company to tell whether or not the person listening on Google Podcast was using a Chrome browser or their Chrome iOS browser or Android browser, or if it was Google Podcast, the player itself, because they're all using a similar code base. But those three, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify, will give you probably 90 some odd % coverage. But here's the deal. Don't stop there. You should list your podcast everywhere somebody listens to podcasts. There are 100 different podcast apps and directories out there. They all feed, well, not all, most of them feed from some common repositories. So if you submit to about 15 to 20 different places, you'll have approximately 100% coverage.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more, Evo. So in other words, you create the audio file of your podcast, you send it to, let's say, Libsyn, one of these podcast hosting companies. Do you then have to set up 100 separate accounts with all of these individual players?
No, you have to set up accounts on about 15 to 20 different applications, different directories that are out there. And by set up an account, it's really no more than, for some of them, there's no account to set up. All you're doing is submitting your RSS feed, which was also generated by your podcast media hosting company. You basically say, Apple Podcasts, here's my RSS feed. Come by and check it as often as you come and check it, so that anybody who uses your directory, your app, is going to be notified or will receive my new episodes. So that's a one-time deal. You do it to Apple, you do it to Google, you do it to Spotify, and about 14, 15 other places that are out there. And once you've done that, you're done. You never have to go back to those sources if you don't wish to, because they're just checking that RSS feed for new episodes.
Thank you, Evo, for all of those insights. And Susan, let's hear from you. We've heard the number 1 million podcasts being mentioned several times today. In other words, there is a lot of competition for people's listening time. So as a content creator, how are you differentiating yourself? How are you creating your brand, your niche?
Well, I have to say, I'm really happy that I'm not starting now. I started about 4 years ago, June 7th. You have to stick to what you love. I always think that, I would never tell anyone not to start a podcast, even though there's a million out there. Because if you want to start something, you should start something. But it should really come from a place of love, because it takes a lot of time to do a podcast well. And I have a very targeted audience. It's people who love to drink. It's people who want to know more about bartenders and bars around the world. So that's not kids. It's not people, I do talk about non-alcoholic beverages as well, and water, wine, anything that you put in a glass. I guess when I first started, there were people out there interviewing bartenders, but it seemed that they were bartenders talking to other bartenders, not just the home bartender or the enthusiast or someone who was inspired by listening to stories about people and how they got where they did, at least in the drinks industry. So, I kind of played under the radar for a little while, and I just, by doing it and keeping doing it weekly, I've made a name for myself as doing it, and I've been lucky enough to be a finalist for some awards. I've won an award, and I think it has to come from the passion that you have. And a lot of people will say niche is everything. Don't be a generalist. Try and pick something where you really know the industry, or that you have something new to say about it. I think that would be my advice for anyone who is starting out new.
Okay. So the other thing I heard you say, I think that contributed to your success is consistency. So creating content, publishing podcasts on a regular, consistent basis. And then the other thing I'm hearing is, stick to your brand or niche that you feel passionate about.
Absolutely. I mean, I do mine. I try and have a podcast a week, or an episode a week. Should I say it's one podcast, an episode a week. I do, though. There's nothing wrong with taking some time off, and I took about 5 weeks off trying to decide what I was going to do when COVID hit, and then I just started, with Squadcast, and I started to interview people again. And I also take Christmas off, maybe 4 weeks, and the summer off 4 weeks. And it really hasn't hurt my numbers. People know that I'm coming back. I tell them when I'm coming back. I usually tell them the date that I'm coming back. So when I leave them, they know. So it's about also talking to your audience and telling them what you're doing. If it's going to be a monthly one, tell them it's a monthly one. Don't just surprise them or think that, oh, I'm going to do one now in a week or in 2 weeks now, that people are going to come back to you. Just because you're doing it here and there. You really have to be consistent and be open and transparent with them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susan. Palle, again, the 1 million podcast number, that sounds pretty daunting to me. How do you find your place out there? So what I'm asking you, in this crowded field, how do you get the word out? How do you market your podcast? What's some advice or tricks to get the word out?
Well, that's really the tricky one, and I like to just add a little bit to the differentiating before we talk about that, because what I'm trying to do is be myself and be personal and share stuff about me as well and my journey, and not just documenting the different destinations I'm going to, because other people, that's what differentiates me, because there's only one of me and there's only one of everybody. So I think that's something we should keep in mind, that people who are listening, we must assume that people listening to Susan's podcast also likes to listen to Susan, and so don't be afraid of sharing stuff about yourself, because you can't be copied. There's only one you. But when it comes to how to promote, it's hard. It's hard, and you want the numbers to grow very fast. Obviously, when you're publishing a new episode, that's part of the platform of your hosting company. That it also goes out to your Facebook page as well, and your YouTube channel, and you can use social media and Twitter and of course, and try to use social media to get it out there as much as you can. And then one thing that really has helped me a lot is being guests on other people's podcasts, and getting people to know you, getting out there, being on a panel about podcasting if Ric asks me to be there, and just accepting whenever people ask if you want to be a part of something. Try to do that and get yourself out there, and but it's hard. So I really like to hear what the other people, Ric and Susan, Evo and Susan, has to say about the whole promoting itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Promoting
Thank you,
yourself.
Palle. And Evo, we're going to change subjects a little bit, but how do I know if my podcast is successful? So what metric should I be looking at? Is it downloads? And if so, how many downloads is a good podcast?
I can tell you how many downloads the average podcast has. Looking at numbers that are provided by Libsyn, who's been mentioned several times here. They have like 70, 80,000 different podcasts, I believe, that are hosted on Libsyn's platform. At the end of the month, Rob Walsh, the vice president of podcaster relations, gets on their podcast called The Feed and rattles off the stats. And I checked the most recent numbers, and I believe it was 125 downloads. That's an average number of 125 downloads happens per episode after the course of 30-ish or so days. So that's how you get to the average.
So just to understand, so 50% of podcasts are getting basically less than 100 downloads an episode.
No, 50% of the podcasts are getting less than 125 downloads, but also 50% of the podcasts out there are getting more than 125. That's how averages work. So there are some podcasts, a very, very small number, small percentages, that get hundreds of thousands of downloads. Some get tens of thousands of downloads. Some get thousands. Most get hundreds. So it's a wide spectrum of how many downloads can you get. But what's that mean? I mean, really, honestly, what does it mean that someone has downloaded your episode? What does it mean that a download was registered? This is a very sticky subject because I don't know about you, but my podcast queue is filled with episodes that I have downloaded that I haven't listened to. There's that. Right. So honestly, the question comes to, what is the size of an audience that I should have that allows me to reach my objectives? And only you out there listening can answer that question. I mean, if you had a platform where every week, if you went to, forget about COVID-19, if you went to your local public library every Thursday and you showed up, and in the audience, 125 people were there, you would consider that successful. That would be really awesome for you. So think about it that way. What are you trying to achieve? What's your goal? I mean, you're not going to make any more money with 125 listeners than you will with 25 listeners or 2,500 listeners because you are not paid by the download. That's not how it works. So what's success? All depends on you.
Okay, so I like that anecdote that you shared, that the glass is half full with 125 downloads or 125 people in the room. Thank you, Evo. And Susan, talking about goals and success and objectives, how do you monetize your podcast? Is there any ability for financial benefit from the podcast?
It's kind of like having a blog. Everyone, when you tell people you're a blogger, podcaster, how do you make money? Very often it's not with that media. All right. Either the blog or the, or that medium, the blog or the podcast. Because my niche is the drinks industry, I have reached out to brands and I have sponsorships with brands, and that's how I do it, or that's how I have earned some money from this. I don't advertise on the site yet. I don't have to discuss success. I have quite a small audience compared to the Tim Ferrisses of the world. So for me to advertise, it wouldn't make that much money to do that, really. Success for me is when someone says, "Oh, that was a great conversation," or "No one's ever asked me that before," because a lot of the people I interview have been interviewed many times before. So again, I'm kind of not answering your question there. Sorry, I'm going on to success. But monetizing for me is going to brands, doing projects with them. I have my blog. I write a lot for my blog. I have recipes on it. So curating content for brands and things like that. So the podcast is just one tool I have, in my tool basket. So I have, the blog, the recipes, Pinterest, my social media, and the podcast. So it's a lot of things going on there.
Okay. Thank you, Susan.
Cool.
And Palle, I'd like to hear the same from you. How are you monetizing your blog? Is it advertising? Is it affiliate sales? Is it working with brands? What's the magic combination for you?
I don't make a lot of money. It barely covers my cost. I have a sponsor on, which is kind of an affiliate thing, and so that is something that I gain a little bit from. I get opportunities. I get invited on press trips. I was in Antigua with Susan, actually, where we were invited just because of the podcast that we're doing with a group of bloggers. And the travel industry is starting to take podcasting serious. I was also in Sri Lanka, which is nice, especially because I want to go anywhere. I did not get paid for that. So I went on and I got all expenses paid. So that's some of the things that come. But I wanted to go to Sri Lanka anyway. So the way I'm seeing it, I saved money, and I ended up doing episodes from there. Not something they required. They were hoping that I would, and I would say something nice, which I did. A thing that I think is really, really interesting is that when you're building a relationship with your listeners, the listeners trust you and what you say. So I will not take any sponsor that comes my way. There's a Danish newspaper that came to me and said, we'd like to be a sponsor on your podcast. And I ended up saying, thank you for the offer, but no thanks, because I don't read your newspaper. And for me to go out and recommend something that I thought it didn't fit. It has to fit. It has to be something that I use myself or could see myself using and would recommend. There's also an insurance company that came to me, and I said, but I'm using another insurance company for my travel insurance. So I can't have that and promote that when I'm not using it myself. A thing, I saw statistics at some point. It was a study from Edison Research in 2019, where it said that 54% of podcast listeners are more willing to buy products from companies they've heard advertised on a podcast. 54%. That's an insane number. I think it also said that 45% actually went to the website. I'm not sure about that, but 54% say that they are more willing. I don't see those kind of numbers in any other medium, and I feel that's because that you have this personal relationship with the podcast, your favorite podcast host, that if he or she says something or recommends something, then it's something they trust and something they're more willing to do. So, and I think that podcasting is really unique in that sense.
Okay, thank you, Palle. And Evo, this next question is from the audience. Hi, Kathy. Thank you for your question. And I know in your past that you worked with Patreon. So explain what Patreon is and how did you leverage Patreon to monetize your podcast?
Patreon was probably one of the first, but now there are several different companies out there that allows you to directly monetize your audience. Doesn't have to be just for podcasting. Patreon supports anything. It goes back to the model of patronage. People decide that the content you are producing, we're just talking about specifically a podcast here, is worthy of supporting, and they throw you a couple of shekels a month. You get to you dictate what those levels are and what rewards they get or maybe don't get for each of those levels. And every month it automatically puts money into your account from that person and the other people that you have who are your patrons. As I mentioned, Patreon is just one of many sources that are out there that will do that. And it's great. But once again, the key focus here is monetizing your audience. Don't launch a page on Patreon and assume that there are people on Patreon who are just waiting for something worthy of supporting. No, that's not the way it works. It is, if you have an audience of 2 and you hope the Patreon's going to make all your bills vanish, you might be overestimating the power of those 2 people. Like anything in life, it's a fraction. It's a small fraction. It's usually a single-digit fraction of the audience that you have that will choose to support you for your efforts. So just be realistic when you think about utilizing Patreon or any of the services that do direct payment structures from your existing audience.
And Evo, can you give us one example, a piece of advice? How do you create value for your patrons?
Well, there are 2 ways, basically. One is people will just support you because they want to support you, and they think that the work that you are doing is worthy, and so therefore you get that. The second way is you reward them. You provide specialized content for your patrons. It doesn't have to be a brand new episode every week. It could be stickers. It could be t-shirts. It could be a shout out on your show. There are lots of different rewards that you can give to people through Patreon or through the other services that are out there. Just keep in mind, if you are going down the route of, if you pay me, I will make more content, just remember, you have to make more content. And that means more energy and effort from you. So as long as you're okay with that, then you should go down that road. I have used Patreon. I still have a Patreon page that is up. When I was the host of the Bangkok podcast, which I am no longer, the show's continuing, they have a Patreon account, and it's doing quite well. They're definitely able to cover costs and more with that. And there are some podcasters out there who make thousands of dollars off of Patreon, and lots of other artists that are out there making more than just podcasts that make serious money utilizing Patreon. But again, it all comes back to your ability to, as you mentioned, Rick, be worthy of supporting and also have a big enough audience to where it makes sense to go that route.
Okay, and we are going to finish up here. And since, Evo, you do have a podcast called Podcast Pontifications, I thought I'd give the last question to you. What do you see as the future of podcasting? It's, in essence, a relatively new medium that's gained a lot of popularity in the last couple of years. What do you see in the near future?
Well, I think the future is going to play out a lot like the present is playing out. And there is a renewed interest, if you will, in podcasting. Even though it's been around for 16 years, it's been relatively slow growth. We are seeing what looks like an unprecedented attention on podcasting these days. And I credit a lot of that to the fact that many people are suddenly finding themselves with extra time on their hands because they're working from home. Now, the big question mark is what happens to these new shows in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, when normality, if that ever comes back around, what does it look like? That's really hard to say. Will they continue? But what I think has definitely happened, it doesn't take much looking into the world around us, especially here in America, and I know it's happened in the other places abroad. The idea of podcasting is part of the lexicon. Many of the stars, celebrities that we all love and know are now starting their own podcasts. It's hard to watch a sitcom and not see a reference to a podcast in it these days. It has become an accepted thing. So we'll continue to see advancements. We'll continue to see new technologies that come around to make not just easier podcasting, but also better podcasting, and a huge amount of interest, especially as the proliferation of smart speakers go on. Smart earbuds are coming, which will change the thing. So if you have any interest at all in making audio-based content, there's never been a better time to do this. And I don't see that changing ever, really. I mean, ever's a very, very long time, but for the immediate future that we're looking at, look out 5 or 10 years, there'll still be plenty of podcasts, and there'll be tens of millions of podcasts, or, like blogs, there's close to 1 billion blogs right now. So we're going to keep doing lots more stuff, and people will keep listening as long as we continue to make interesting content.
Okay. So everybody, podcasting is here to stay. And consider this as one of your platforms that you're utilizing for content creation. I'm going to bring in all my panelists here. A giant thank you to Evo Susan, and Palle, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Everybody, please remember on June 2nd, we're going to be having part 2 of the advanced sessions for creating a podcast. And of course, you're going to be able to see a replay of this on Facebook, YouTube, as well as travelmassive.com. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we do appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.